What if I told you that the true origin of the biblical peoples is deeply rooted in the heart of Africa? What if everything you've learned about sacred figures, the tribes of Israel, the prophets, even about Jesus himself, was incomplete, or worse, deliberately distorted? Prepare yourself for a journey that will shake the foundations of your traditional faith and challenge everything you thought you knew about the scriptures. This video is not just another biblical curiosity, it's a call to truth. To the truth that has been hidden, erased, silenced throughout the centuries by religious, political, and even racial interests. Have you ever wondered why Africa is rarely mentioned when the topic is the Bible, even though it is the continent most frequently mentioned in ancient records? Despite being the cradle of ancient civilizations such as Kush, Egypt, and Ethiopia, all clearly mentioned in sacred texts, why is the image we are sold of biblical characters always European, clear, standardized, when the historical and geographical context takes us to another place? This omission is not an innocent mistake. It's a strategy, a systematic attempt to erase the African contribution from humanity's spiritual narrative. And today, you'll understand why this truth was hidden for so long, and who benefited from this silence. Let's talk about names you know very well: Moses, Solomon, the Queen of Sheba, Joseph, Mary, and even Jesus, but in a new light. A light closer to the historical, cultural, and geographical reality of the time. A light that points to an Afro-Oriental ancestry, which directly, clearly, and unquestionably links the biblical peoples to the African continent. Perhaps you grew up seeing images, films, and illustrations that depicted all these characters with European features. But stop and think. If Moses was raised as an Egyptian, in an Egyptian palace, and no one identified him as different, how could he have looked so distinct from the Egyptians? If Jesus was taken to Egypt as a baby to hide from Herod, why hide a white child among dark-skinned Egyptians? These questions are not offensive. They are necessary, because the truth sets you free. But first, it makes you uncomfortable. Prepare to discover historical facts, forgotten biblical passages, and spiritual connections that show Africa was not only part of biblical history, it was its epicenter. While many try to hide this origin, we will reveal it, based on studies, archaeology, ancient texts, and revelations that challenge modern dogmas. And no, we are not here to fuel controversy, but rather to restore Africa to its rightful place of honor within the history of humanity, within the Bible, and within its own spiritual identity. You are about to discover 10 truths that can transform your view of faith, history, and the Bible forever. And these truths are not inventions. They were there the whole time, in the subtext, on the maps, in the names, in the genealogies that no one wanted to explain to you clearly. So, if you feel there is more to the Bible than what has been taught in traditional pulpits, if you sense that the sacred story has been told incompletely, and if you're ready to delve deep into the African roots of biblical faith, stay with me until the end, because what we are about to reveal may forever change what you believe about your past and about your place in God's spiritual plan. But before we continue with this revelation, I need to ask you something very important. Comment below. What have you always suspected, but never dared to ask, about the African origins of the biblical peoples? What shocks or intrigues you most in this search for the hidden truth? Your comments are essential because they are what allow this message to reach a wider audience. When you comment, YouTube understands that this content is relevant and starts showing it to more people. And honestly, the world needs to hear this. If you feel that this topic has sparked something in you, if something inside you has started to make sense now, leave a like, because it shows us that this type of content needs to continue. And subscribe to the channel right now, because in the coming weeks, we're going to delve even deeper into this truth, with new videos about the forgotten books of the Bible, the true appearance of Jesus, and the hidden role of Africa in biblical prophecies. You can't miss out. This channel is a safe space to seek answers, question narratives, and restore the spiritual identity of a people who have been erased, but who are awakening. What many don't know, or perhaps don't want you to know, is that the trade and migration routes between Africa and the Middle East are as old as the biblical records themselves. Since the time of Abraham, even before the official formation of the people of Israel, there was intense movement between these regions. Nomadic peoples, pastoral tribes, caravans of merchants, soldiers, armies, and even prophets circulated freely between the lands we now know as Ethiopia, Sudan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. These connections were not exceptions, but rather the norm of the time. And the most surprising thing? The Bible openly acknowledges this. It cites dozens of times names like Cush, Nubia, Ethiopia, Mizraim, all places or peoples linked to sub-Saharan Africa, well before the existence of modern countries or political borders. But for some reason, these details have never been emphasized in sermons, Sunday school lessons, or films that portray biblical history. Have you ever heard of the land of Cush? It appears in Genesis, Exodus, Isaiah, Zephaniah, and even Acts. Cush was a direct descendant of Ham, son of Noah, and according to ancient accounts, his descendants gave rise to peoples who inhabited regions south of Egypt, that is, what we know today as Sudan and parts of Ethiopia. The Bible not only mentions the land of Cush, but also speaks of powerful kings, formidable armies, and a thriving culture. But ask most Christians today if they know who Cush was, and the silence will tell you everything you need to know about this erasure. Nubia, one of the oldest civilizations in Africa, also had a great influence on Egypt and consequently on the Hebrews. Several pharaohs who ruled Egypt were Nubian, dark-skinned, with African features and a sophisticated culture. The 25th dynasty, for example, became known as the dynasty of the Black Pharaohs. And Egypt, as you may remember, was the place where Moses grew up, where Joseph ruled, and where Jesus was taken as a baby. It is impossible to separate Egypt from the biblical narrative, and even more impossible to ignore the African origin of its geography and its people. Ethiopia, in turn, is mentioned with respect and reverence in sacred texts. David speaks of Ethiopia's greatness. The prophets place it in contexts of salvation and judgment. The Queen of Sheba, who, according to tradition, was an Ethiopian monarch, visits Solomon, and from this union, many scholars claim a royal lineage arose that continues to be celebrated to this day by Rastafarians and Ethiopian Christians. And we cannot forget the famous episode in the Acts of the Apostles when Philip baptizes the Ethiopian eunuch, a high-ranking official in the court of Candace, the Queen of Ethiopia. An African, a reader of the book of Isaiah, seeking spiritual understanding and receiving baptism directly from an apostle. This scene, in itself, challenges all traditional representations of the Christian faith as a European phenomenon. But the burning question is, why is this never taught in churches? Why, with so many names, so many quotes, so much visible evidence, is the African contribution to the biblical narrative systematically ignored? The answer, unfortunately, is uncomfortable. Because acknowledging this truth would mean retelling the whole story from another perspective. A perspective where the biblical peoples have black features, where the prophets emerge in African contexts, where the chosen people are not white, blonde, and blue-eyed, but rather mixed, tanned, dark-skinned, like the peoples who still live today in the Sahel, the Nile, and the Ethiopian mountains. This historical erasure did not happen by chance. It was the result of centuries of European domination over the interpretation of Scripture. During the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the Reformation, Western artists and theologians reconstructed the Bible in their own image. Jesus came to be portrayed as European. Mary became a white woman with gentle features. Angels gained golden hair, and African peoples were slowly excluded or demonized in visual representations, texts, and sermons. All this in the name of a theology that served colonial and racial interests. But today, that narrative is beginning to crumble, because historical, archaeological, and spiritual evidence is emerging as never before. Writers, pastors, researchers, and scholars around the world are rediscovering the profound connection between Africa and biblical figures, and you are in the midst of this awakening. This is a rare, powerful moment, a true call to open your eyes and see the Word as it was truly written, lived, and preserved. Reflect with me. Why was the people of Israel formed in Egypt? Why did Abraham pass through Egypt? Why did Joseph become governor there? Why was Moses raised as a prince in the palace of the pharaohs? Why did the prophets flee to African regions during times of persecution? Why did Jesus hide among the Egyptians when he was still a baby? What do all these events have in common? The answer is before us. Africa is the backdrop for almost all of ancient biblical history. It's as if the Bible has been shouting this from its very first pages, but no one is willing to listen. As if the genealogies, the maps, the names, everything points to the south, to the center, and to the east of Africa. But we have our eyes fixed on Northern Europe, waiting for answers that will never come from there. And that's why this video exists. To pave the way, to rekindle the flame, to awaken consciences that have been asleep for centuries to Eurocentric doctrines. And now that we've begun to lift this veil, it's impossible to stop, because once you see it, there's no way to unsee it anymore. What comes next will delve even deeper into this journey. We'll explore names, lineages, and direct connections between characters you know well, and a spiritual heritage that may be yours, and you don't even know it yet. So, if this has touched you in any way, I want to invite you to leave a comment right now below. It can be a simple phrase like, "Africa is in the Bible," or even a question, "Why didn't they tell us this before?" Write what you're feeling, what this made you reflect on. Your comments aren't just support for the channel, they are real seeds planted in fertile soil. And when we talk about Africa within the Bible, it's impossible to continue without mentioning Cush, a name that appears from the beginning of the scriptures, but which unfortunately has been treated as a mere footnote in conventional teachings. Cush was the son of Ham, who in turn was the son of Noah. That is, Cush is the direct grandson of the one who, according to the biblical account, was the only survivor with his family of the Great Flood. That alone would be enough to spark the interest of any Bible reader, right? But no. For some reason that you may already be beginning to realize, the name of Cush and his descendants have been systematically relegated to the shadows of biblical history. The name Cush appears everywhere. We're not talking about an isolated mention. It appears in Genesis 10, where we read the famous Table of Nations, also known as the genealogy of Noah's sons. There it is written in bold, "And the sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan." And immediately afterward, the text says that Cush begat Nimrod, the first mighty man on earth. Here we have a bombshell that few stop to consider. According to the sacred text itself, Nimrod, known for founding great cities like Babel, Erech, and Nineveh, was the grandson of Ham and the son of Cush. In other words, a man of African origin, black, was responsible for building the first empires and urban centers in human history. Pause to think about this. Why isn't this information printed in theology textbooks? Why, throughout Christian history, have figures like Nimrod been whitewashed or simply relegated to generic categories like Semitic or Oriental? The answer, once again, leads us to the same point: the intentional attempt to erase the participation of Black, African, and Cushite people in the construction of biblical civilization. Returning to the name Cush, you will find this term directly linked to the region we now call Sudan and parts of Ethiopia. In many biblical translations, Cush is simply replaced by Ethiopia, which can confuse the modern reader, who thinks of Ethiopia only as the current country in East Africa. But in the biblical context, the land of Cush encompassed a vast expanse south of Egypt, including various nations and peoples of distinctly African, Black, and culturally advanced origin. And if you think all this is too symbolic, just wait until you hear what the prophet said about Cush. In Isaiah 18, for example, there is a specific prophecy for the land of Cush. The text says, "Woe to the land of buzzing wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia." And further on, God himself declares that he will offer a tribute from the land of Cush. That is, there is a divine recognition of the presence, importance, and spirituality of this people. They were not just nearby. They were an active part of God's revelation, plan, and action on earth. Furthermore, in the book of Zephaniah 3:10, the prophet announces, "From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my worshippers, the daughter of my scattered people, shall bring me offerings." This passage is deeply symbolic. God is speaking of a people who were scattered, and yet, even dispersed, they continue to be called my people. How many times have you heard this prophecy explained with such clarity? How many times have you been taught that the people of Cush were recognized as legitimate worshippers belonging to God, even though they were geographically distant from Jerusalem? And there's more. In Jeremiah 13:23, there's a phrase that is frequently misused and misinterpreted. Can the Ethiopian change his skin? This rhetorical question is, in fact, a statement of the obvious. The Ethiopian, or the Cushite, has dark black skin, and this is a natural part of his identity. This mention is not offensive, as some think. On the contrary, it serves to reinforce that black identity was a notorious fact, recognized by the biblical authors themselves. They knew, they saw, they wrote. Skin color was evident and was recorded without hesitation. The Bible, then, gives us strong testimony that the descendants of Cush, dark-skinned Africans, were present at all the great moments in salvation history. They were not merely bystanders. They were in Egypt with Moses. They were with Solomon through the Queen of Sheba. They were with the apostles at the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch. They were present in the messianic prophecies. And all of this has been progressively forgotten, omitted, or distorted by the Eurocentric lenses that have dominated Christian theology for over 1,000 years. The question remains, why? Why don't they want you to see Cush for who he truly was? A powerful ancestor, a father of African nations, a living symbol of the black presence in the Bible. Why do they insist on severing these roots? Perhaps because recognizing this would radically change how millions of people see themselves within the faith. Perhaps because it would strengthen the spiritual self-esteem of a generation that has always been led to believe that being black means being outside the promise, outside the lineage, outside God's plan. But that's a lie, and you are here today to undo that lie. Now that you know who Cush was, the impact of his lineage, and the legitimate black presence in sacred records, you can begin to realize that he wasn't the only one. There are other names, other nations, other lineages, other African connections that have also been silenced. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next. So don't stop now. What comes next will broaden your perspective even further. If this has already shaken what you believe to be true, if this new perspective is making you think, question, and even feel emotional, then it's time to take a stand. Leave a comment below with a phrase like, "Cush is part of my story," or even a question. What other biblical character might have African origins? Comment on what has surprised you the most so far. Your interaction is what helps this video reach those who also need this truth. Now that you understand the role of Cush and his descendants as forgotten pillars of biblical history, it's time to look more closely at one of the most mysterious and sacred places in all of humanity's spiritual narrative, Ethiopia. Yes, that ancient mountainous land of scorching sun and profound faith, which since ancient times has echoed in the scriptures as a territory of revelations, power, wisdom, and divine presence. But what makes Ethiopia so special? Why does it appear so many times in the sacred pages and at the same time is so little remembered in modern pulpits? Are we facing a biblical truth neglected for centuries? Was Ethiopia, in fact, a holy land even before Israel? To understand this, we need to go back in time, more specifically to the reign of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. Solomon is an iconic figure in the Bible, known for his unparalleled wisdom, extraordinary wealth, and profound spiritual connection. And it was precisely this fame that crossed borders and reached the heart of Ethiopia. The Bible recounts that, upon hearing of Solomon's wisdom, a queen, the Queen of Sheba, organized a vast caravan laden with riches, perfumes, precious stones, and difficult questions, and traveled to Jerusalem to see him with her own eyes. And here, my friends, begins one of the most enigmatic and powerful chapters in all of African spiritual history. The Queen of Sheba was not merely a curious visitor. She was a powerful, independent, intelligent, strategic, and above all, spiritual ruler. Her interest in Solomon was not just political, but profoundly existential. She wanted to understand the source of that man's wisdom, to touch the sacred, to experience the presence of God who, according to rumors, dwelt among the Hebrew people. And when she finally met Solomon, the Bible says that all the questions she brought were answered, and that what she saw with her own eyes exceeded all that she had heard. This encounter changes everything, not only for her, but for the history of Ethiopia. It is from this encounter that the oldest and most solid traditions of biblical Ethiopia arise. According to millennia-old records preserved in Ethiopian culture, a son was born from this encounter, Menelik III. And Menelik, upon growing up, is said to have visited Jerusalem and returned to Ethiopia, carrying with him nothing less than the Ark of the Covenant itself. That's right, the Ark that contained the tablets of the law given to Moses, the ultimate symbol of God's presence among the Hebrews. The Ark that guided the Israelites in battles, that dwelt in the Holy of Holies, that was untouchable. This Ark, according to Ethiopian tradition, was never destroyed, but taken with honor to Ethiopia. where it remains to this day under protection and mystery in the sacred city of Axum. Think about the weight of that. While the Western world searches for the Ark in caves, temples, Hollywood theories, and documentaries full of visual effects, the Ethiopian people have calmly affirmed for centuries, "It is with us." Guarded by monks, protected by fasts and prayers, never displayed, but always revered. This conviction is not based on modern legends, but on ancient manuscripts, solid oral traditions, and a lineage that has never been broken. And that changes everything. If the Ark of the Covenant is truly in Ethiopia, what does that tell us about that nation's role in God's spiritual plan? If the lineage of the Queen of Sheba truly originated a dynasty that claimed direct descent from Solomon, what does that reveal about God's covenant with the African peoples? If Ethiopia was already considered a symbol of reverence, wisdom, and spirituality since the times of the Old Testament, why has that brilliance been extinguished from history? The truth is that Ethiopia has always been viewed with respect and awe by the biblical authors themselves. There is not a single mention that portrays it as an enemy of God. On the contrary, in several passages, we see God defending Ethiopia, exalting the Cushite people, and making specific promises of salvation and redemption for that land. And all this even before the founding of Jerusalem as a spiritual center. It is as if Ethiopia were a beacon lit in the midst of the spiritual darkness of the nations, a place where God already manifested himself, even before the religious structures of Israel were established, a holy land before the Holy Land. And that is why, even today, Ethiopians guard their faith with such intensity. Christianity arrived there in the first centuries of the Christian era, long before it became established in Europe. And what is most fascinating, when European missionaries arrived in Ethiopia, hoping to convert the natives, they discovered an already established church with doctrine, liturgy, tradition, and profound devotion. This caused astonishment, because how could a forgotten and distant people have so faithfully preserved a faith that many didn't even imagine existed outside of Rome, Greece, or Jerusalem? The answer lies in the Bible itself, because Ethiopia was never forgotten by God. It was the world that forgot it. The question that needs to resonate now is, why is there so much silence about this in modern pulpits? Why is Ethiopia's role not celebrated with the same force as Jerusalem, Rome, or other historic cities of faith? Perhaps because admitting this would shift the center of world spirituality. Perhaps because the image of the black person as a spiritual protagonist is more unsettling than it should be. Perhaps because recognizing Ethiopia as a holy land before Israel would place Africa not on the periphery of faith, but at its center. And this is something that needs to be said clearly, because when we learn about the history of Ethiopia, the Queen of Sheba, the Ark of the Covenant, and Menelik, we realize that African faith is not a copy, not a reflection, not something that came later. It is the root, it is the origin, it is the foundation, and this truth changes everything. It changes how we see the Bible, how we see ourselves within the faith, and how we reconnect with a spirituality that, for a long time, was taken from us. If you are feeling this impact now, know that this is just the beginning. We still have much to reveal. Many names, many places, many events that prove that Africa was not just a witness to the Bible. It was a stage, a character, an altar. And so, in the next segment, we will continue this journey, revealing how Jesus and his family were welcomed and protected on African soil, and what this means for a true understanding of the Christian faith. But before we move on, I want you to do something for me and for this message. Write in the comments, "Ethiopia is Holy Land." And if something touched you in this passage, share your reflection, your question, or even a memory. You can also write, "Why is Ethiopia hidden from the Bible?" Your participation is more than a gesture. It is an act of spiritual resistance. Oh, and don't forget, like this video right now if it's opening your eyes. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now, because in the next segment we're going to reveal one of the most hidden parts of the story, Jesus' direct connection to Africa. If you've already realized how intertwined the African presence is with the roots of biblical history, what comes next may forever change how you see the Messiah himself. Yes, I'm talking about Jesus, because you can't talk about the origin of the biblical peoples and the African presence without paying attention to the fact that Jesus spent part of his childhood in Egypt. And it wasn't by chance. This wasn't an unimportant detail. It was a divine choice. And like every choice of God, it has a purpose. So stop and reflect with me. Why would the Messiah have been taken specifically to Egypt? When Herod decreed the massacre of the innocents, Joseph had a dream in which an angel warned him about the danger threatening the baby Jesus. The order was clear: flee. But the destination was also clear: Egypt. It could have been another land, another place. But no, it was to Egypt that the Savior of humanity was to be taken and hidden. Now, think with me sincerely. Why would Jesus be hidden precisely in an African territory, populated by dark-skinned people with African features, if he were so physically different as to immediately stand out? Do you realize the power of this question? Do you realize how much it dismantles several mental images that have been instilled in us over the centuries? If Jesus had a European appearance, light hair, blue eyes, and pale skin, could he really have gone unnoticed in Egypt? The answer seems obvious. No, he couldn't. Egypt at that time was not a multicultural territory as we know it today. It was an African land, governed by a black people, with customs, features, and culture rooted in the African continent. To blend in among them, Jesus would have had to look like them. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is historical logic. And this logic aligns with the biblical accounts themselves. The Bible doesn't concern itself with describing Jesus' physical appearance in detail, perhaps because that was never the most important thing, but at the same time, it gives us clues, and God's own choice to hide the Messiah in Africa as a child tells us more than 1,000 written words. But then, where did this image of a European Jesus come from? How was this visual narrative constructed? The answer lies in the history of Christian art itself. During the first centuries of the Christian faith, especially in African communities, Jesus was portrayed as a dark-skinned man with Asian features. This can be seen in ancient icons found in Coptic monasteries in Egypt and in Ethiopian manuscripts. But with the expansion of Christianity in the Roman Empire and later in medieval Europe, these representations began to change drastically. Jesus began to be portrayed with European features: fair skin, blue eyes, straight brown hair, even blonde in some versions. This new image did not arise from divine revelation, but from political and cultural convenience. It was easier for European peoples to accept and venerate a savior who looked like them. It was more functional for the project of colonial domination and expansion to show the world that the Messiah had Western features, even if this contradicted geographical and historical facts. Over time, this white image of Jesus was imposed as the only one. Churches, stained glass windows, films, books, and even children's drawings replicated this standardized version as if it were the only possible one, and we, who inherited the faith, came to accept it without questioning. But now the time has come to question, because the truth sets us free. And the truth is that Jesus was a man from the Middle East, who lived part of his life in North Africa, who grew up in an environment of intersection between the Hebrew world and African influences, and who most likely had an appearance similar to the men of his time and culture: dark skin, curly hair, Semitic features mixed with African ones. When we understand this, everything changes. Because it's not just about the color of Jesus' skin. It's about the intentional inclusion of an entire people in the history of salvation. It's about reclaiming the spiritual dignity of generations that were taught to worship a God who didn't look like them. It's about breaking the cycle of exclusion, shame, and inferiority built through manipulated images. And this manipulation doesn't stop at appearances. It reaches the symbolism, the representation of holiness, the idea of who can occupy the place of the sacred. By presenting a European Jesus as the standard, Western Christian culture sent a clear, albeit unconscious message: God is white. And if God is white, what is left for black people? Where is their place in salvation? Where is their reflection in divinity? That is why revisiting this detail of Jesus' life, his stay in Egypt, is not merely a historical study. It is an act of spiritual rescue. It is looking at the scriptures with new eyes and realizing that Africa was not a plan B in Jesus' life. It was a fundamental part of his protection, his formation, and, why not, his identity. Can you imagine the baby Jesus playing in Egyptian villages, listening to stories in local languages, observing African customs, being embraced by black arms? learning from the sounds, smells, and colors of that rich and vibrant land, because that is exactly what happened. The Savior of the world was welcomed on African soil, and this should be remembered, celebrated, and taught, because it shows, directly and symbolically, that Africa is part of the foundation of the Christian faith, and that the color of Jesus' skin should never have been transformed into a standard of holiness, but rather as a symbol of unity among all peoples. The question you need to ask yourself now is, why did they hide this from us? Why did they go to such lengths to whitewash the image of a man who lived, walked, and grew up among dark-skinned people? Why was biblical Egypt romanticized as if it were a neutral space without racial identity, when in fact it was a center of culture, science, spirituality, and yes, an African territory? It's not just a matter of color, it's a matter of historical and spiritual recognition. And by bringing this truth to light, we are taking a step toward a more just understanding of the Bible and faith. We are breaking with centuries of distortions and opening space for more people to see themselves as a legitimate part of the divine plan. And we're only just getting started. What follows will show you that Jesus wasn't the only one. Several other important biblical figures were of African descent, and the evidence is right before our eyes. We just lack the courage to see it. Now, before we move on, I want to hear from you. Write in the comments, Jesus lived in Egypt and that matters, or Africa welcomed the Savior. Share your impression here, what this passage awakened in you. It can be a reflection, a question, a memory. What matters is that you express yourself. When you comment, you help this truth reach more hearts. After understanding that Jesus lived in Egypt, that he grew up surrounded by an African culture, and that this has much deeper implications than simply geographical ones, we are compelled to ask a question that perhaps you have never allowed yourself to honestly ask. And the other biblical characters? What were Moses, Joseph, Mary, the prophets, the kings, and even the apostles really like? Is the image we have of them today faithful to reality, or is it just another reflection of the historical manipulation done by Western theology over the centuries? The truth is that many biblical characters who likely had Afro-Asian features were purposefully whitened over the last 2,000 years. And this process wasn't just an artistic matter. It was an ideological project, a mechanism of cultural domination. By modifying the appearance of sacred figures, especially the most important and beloved ones, an ideal of sanctity was created, linked to white skin and European features. As a result, millions of black people around the world grew up with the unconscious feeling that they were outside the center of the sacred narrative, that they were merely spectators, not legitimate heirs to this history. Let's start with Moses, the liberator of the Hebrew people, the one who confronted Pharaoh, who received the tablets of the law, who guided Israel through the desert. Moses was raised as an Egyptian. Adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, he grew up among African nobility, educated as a prince of the Nile, and the Bible never mentions that he was identified as different among the Egyptian people. On the contrary, his Hebrew origin was a secret for a long time. Now think, how could he have hidden his true origin if his appearance was so distinct from that of the Egyptians? The only logical explanation is that Moses had features similar to those of the Africans among whom he was raised. He was Hebrew, yes, but the Hebrews of that time did not have a European appearance. They were men and women of mixed race with the peoples of the Afro-Asian region, with dark skin, strong features, curly or wavy hair, as is still common among various groups in the Middle East and East Africa today. Then we have Joseph, Jacob's son, sold by his brothers and taken to Egypt as a slave. Joseph becomes governor of Egypt, the second most powerful man in the country, and the Bible says that his brothers did not recognize him when they met him years later. If he had looked completely different, how could he have deceived them? Furthermore, he married an Egyptian woman, the daughter of a priest, and his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, became part of the tribes of Israel. This means that the 12 tribes of Israel carry African blood in their roots. Egypt was not just a place of passage, it was an active part of the genealogy of the chosen people. And we cannot forget Mary, the mother of Jesus, the most exalted woman in the Christian narrative. Mary was Jewish, but the Jews of that time were not like the European Jews of centuries later. They had Semitic African origins, descendants of Abraham, who came from the Mesopotamian region and whose descendants lived for generations in Egypt. Mary was a simple woman from Galilee, a peripheral, mixed region marked by contact with different ethnicities and peoples. It is very likely that Mary had dark brown skin, curly or wavy hair, and robust features. And yet, what do we see in traditional images? A woman with white skin, light eyes, and blue and white clothes, as if she were a European princess. Do you realize the impact of this? These images weren't created to represent the truth. They were created to reinforce an ideal of racial purity. Hollywood reinforced it. Renaissance art consolidated it. Theology textbooks passed it on unquestioningly. And we, for a long time, consumed these images as if they were authentic, without realizing that we were being unconsciously taught to reject any image of holiness that didn't fit this European standard. This is even more serious when we look at the oral tradition and archaeological records of the region. Ancient paintings, mosaics, and records found in early Christian communities in North Africa and the Middle East show figures with dark skin tones, striking eyes, curly hair, and clothing typical of Afro-Oriental culture. The first Christians in Ethiopia, Egypt, Syria, and regions of the Fertile Crescent never imagined Jesus, Mary, or Moses as Europeans. This only happened when Christianity became institutionalized in the Roman Empire and later in Western Europe, where it was necessary to adapt religious imagery to the dominant culture. But perhaps the greatest impact of all this is not just historical, but psychological and spiritual. Because when you believe that biblical characters look like you feel part of the story. You feel included, called, represented. But when you never see yourself in the sacred figures, when your skin color never appears in the paintings, when your hair is never the standard depicted in the angels, the prophets, the kings, you begin to feel distant from all of that. And that weakens you. It steals your spiritual identity. It undermines your connection with what is divine. And that's why we're talking about this now. Because the time has come to rescue, to reveal, to reconstruct the image of these characters, not based on racial dogmas, but based on cultural, historical, and biblical evidence. The time has come to look at Moses, Joseph, Mary, and so many others with eyes of truth, and to recognize that the Christian faith and biblical history are much more Black and African than most people have been taught to believe. And this process is not easy, because it requires unlearning. It requires the courage to question what has always been presented as right. But the reward is liberating. When you see yourself reflected in the history of faith, everything changes. You understand that you have always been a part of it, that your skin, your hair, your features also bear the image and likeness of the Creator. And that is revolutionary. What we're about to reveal in the next few minutes will resonate even more deeply, because there are other names, other figures, other truths that need to come to light. But for now, I want to invite you to reflect and comment below. They didn't look like Hollywood portrayed them. Write that down, or tell me which biblical character you always imagined a certain way, and now you're seeing them differently. You can also write, Moses looked like me, or Mary looked like me. Each of your comments is a step in this collective journey of restoration and truth. We've reached one of the most delicate parts of this journey. Because now that you've begun to see the truth behind the real appearance of biblical characters, you've recognized the undeniable presence of Africa in the Bible, and you've understood that much has been hidden for centuries. It's impossible not to ask an uncomfortable question, perhaps the most necessary of all. Why was this story erased? Who decided that Black people didn't deserve to be at the center of the narrative? Who rewrote the spiritual memory of millions of people to place them on the margins of the divine promise? The answer is not simple, but it is urgent. To understand it, we need to look beyond theology. We need to delve into history, not the history told in textbooks, but the history that has been buried, hidden, or blatantly distorted over the centuries. The truth is that the erasure of the African presence in the Bible was not an innocent mistake. It was a project of power. With the expansion of Christianity in Europe and the rise of major colonial powers, faith began to be used as a tool of domination. It was no longer just about salvation, but about conquest, cultural imposition, and spiritual control. And for this project to work, it was necessary to reshape the image of God, the prophets, the kings, and all the protagonists of faith, making them resemble the colonizers, not the colonized. This is how what we now call theological Eurocentrism was born, a theology constructed from the political, racial, and cultural interests of Europe, which centralized religious power in Rome, Paris, London, Geneva, and which gradually replaced the Eastern and African roots of the faith with a Europeanized, sanitized, whitewashed version of the Bible. And the more Europe expanded its dominion over the world, the more this theology was imposed as the only and absolute one. African, Asian, and indigenous peoples were forced to abandon their cultural and spiritual expressions. Missionaries arrived with a cross in one hand and a sword in the other, saying that salvation was white, had blue eyes, and a European accent. And in this process, thousands of manuscripts were destroyed, local traditions erased, languages extinguished, and spiritual leaders demoralized, all in the name of a Christianity that had already strayed from its origins. The saddest part is that this wasn't just external imposition. Over time, the descendants of these colonized peoples themselves came to believe in this distorted version of faith. They accepted the narrative that placed them as mere supporting characters. They accepted the silence imposed on their origins. Many began to reject their features, their culture, their names, their ancestry, believing that only by resembling the oppressor could they get closer to the true God. But this God presented by them had, in fact, already been kidnapped, transformed into an ideological tool. If you look closely, you will realize that there is concrete evidence of historical censorship. How many books were removed from the Bible? How many apocryphal texts speak of the presence of African peoples, the wisdom of Ethiopian kings, the influence of black women in the emergence of the church? How many ancient documents remained confined to private libraries, closed monasteries, archives that no one accesses? Why were so many manuscripts lost? Why is it that whenever an ancient representation of biblical characters with dark skin is found, it is labeled as unreliable, regional, or folklore? And what about the translations? How many biblical passages have undergone subtle adaptations, replacing words like Cush with Ethiopia, and then with distant land? How many times has the word black been omitted from liturgical texts? How many parables have been left untold from the perspective of those who actually lived in the hot land, in the desert, in the Nile valleys? History was edited, little by little, with surgical precision. And this editing had a clear objective: to keep black people distant from the sacred, because a people who recognize themselves in the history of faith are a people who rise up, a people who see their image reflected in Moses, in Mary, in Solomon, in Jesus, no longer accept being enslaved, subservient, marginalized, a people who know that their ancestors were part of divine revelation, no longer bow down before cultural humiliation. That is why this truth has been silenced. Because it is dangerous, because it is liberating, because it restores to the African people the spiritual dignity that has been stolen from them, and more. It questions the religious system that has profited for centuries from lies, that built empires on exclusion, that sold crosses, dogmas, and images in the name of a God fabricated to serve power and not truth. There are also theories that suggest this erasure was orchestrated from the earliest church councils, where leaders decided what would be considered canonical and what would be discarded. Books that gave voice to black characters or that revealed deep connections to Africa were left out. And over time, everything that didn't fit the European vision was classified as heresy. But was the heresy the content or the place from which it came? This distortion didn't stop in the past. It continues to live on today. How many churches have you seen with white images of all the characters? How many times have you heard sermons exalting the people of Israel as white and pure, and describing the descendants of Ham as cursed? How many times has the African continent been portrayed in worship services as a symbol of misery, idolatry, and spiritual darkness? All of this was programmed. None of it was spontaneous. But the truth, as always, endures. It remains alive in the ancient texts that have survived, in the African traditions that have kept the fire of faith burning even under persecution, in the chants that blend the Bible with drumming, in the eyes of those who never stopped searching. And now, this truth is returning with force. We are living in a time of restoration, where the sons and daughters of spiritual Africa are rediscovering their place in God's plan. And you are part of this. If you've made it this far, It's because something inside you recognizes that there's more to this story, that your faith deserves to be connected to the whole truth, that you weren't born to be a spectator, but the protagonist of your own sacred story. Don't let them silence you. Don't accept another theology that excludes you. Before we move on to the next revelation, I want to invite you to write here in the comments, "History was erased, but I'm recovering it." Or if you prefer, say, "Africa is in the Bible and always has been." Share what you felt listening to this excerpt. Which part touched you the most? Which truth made you want to get up from your chair and shout? Now that you understand why there is so much erasure, distortion, and historical silencing, it's time to expand this vision even further. Because we are not just talking about specific characters or isolated episodes, we are talking about a deep and ancient movement that can explain why so many African peoples carry spiritual, cultural, and even linguistic traits that connect directly with the ancient Hebrews of the Bible. And the question that needs to resonate now is, did entire tribes of Israel migrate to Africa and preserve their identity there? It may seem bold at first glance, perhaps even shocking to those who have been taught to believe that the Hebrew faith was born, grew, and remained only in the territory of present-day Israel. But historical records, anthropological remains, and, above all, the cultural traces that survive to this day in different regions of Africa lead us to consider, with increasing seriousness, that some of the tribes of Israel migrated to the African continent and flourished there. After the division of the Kingdom of Israel, when 10 tribes separated from the house of David, a process of dispersion began that the Bible itself calls the diaspora. Many scholars agree that these tribes disappeared from official historical records. They are the so-called lost tribes of Israel. But did they really disappear? Or did they simply go where no one else wanted to look? Africa has always been right there. Canaan's natural southern border is Egypt. From there, access to the rest of Africa is direct. And historically, we know that trade, migration, and even spiritual roots have linked these regions since ancient times. There is evidence of Israelite communities that lived in Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, and even in the interior of the African continent. Peoples who maintained Hebrew practices, circumcision on the 8th day, kosher dietary restrictions, festivals similar to those ordained in the Torah, use of ancient Hebrew names, and even observance of the Sabbath, Shabbat. One of the best-known cases is that of the Beta Israel people, the Ethiopian Jews. For centuries, they lived in the Ethiopian highlands, preserving a faith that bears striking similarities to ancient Judaism, even without contact with the European Jewish community. They claim to be descendants of the tribe of Dan. Their history, according to oral tradition, dates back to the reign of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. When modern scholars and archaeologists encountered them, they were impressed. How was it possible that such specific practices of the Mosaic faith had been preserved for millennia in African territory? But this is not the only case. Several other African peoples have been the subject of study for presenting cultural elements identical to those of ancient Israel. The Igbo people in Nigeria, for example, have been recognized by researchers and religious leaders as possible descendants of Israelite tribes. They observe the Sabbath, have purity rituals similar to those in the book of Leviticus, use names that sound Hebrew, and their oral tradition speaks of a departure from an ancestral land after wars and persecutions, a kind of new exodus. Other groups, such as the Lemba in southern Africa, also claim Israelite origins. Genetic tests conducted on members of this people have identified traces of the Jewish priesthood haplogroup, the so-called Kohanim, in the DNA of many of their leaders. This is one of the strongest and most undeniable findings from a scientific point of view. They maintain rigorous dietary practices, purification rituals, and even marriage customs within the lineage, something very present among the ancient Israelites. Do you realize what all this means? These peoples, scattered across different parts of Africa, not only resemble the ancient Hebrews culturally, they preserve codes of conduct, faith, and spirituality that are virtually impossible to have been created from scratch without a common origin. They are not imitations, they are living heritages. Furthermore, the Bible in its prophecies already stated that God would scatter his people among the nations, and that one day, in due time, he would bring them back from all parts of the earth, including the lands beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. This type of language is not metaphorical. It points to a living, spiritual, and yes, Hebrew Africa. perhaps much more Hebrew than most people are prepared to accept. And it is at this point that the much discussed and simultaneously avoided concept arises, the concept of Black Hebrews. For many, this is still an affront to what has been taught, but the question that needs to be asked is, an affront to whom? To the truth, or to the system that profits from lies? When we look at the Bible with decolonized eyes, we realize that the Hebrew faith was born in regions where the majority of the population had dark skin. Abraham was from Mesopotamia, Moses grew up in Egypt, Joseph married an Egyptian woman, Solomon had contact with Ethiopia, and Jesus lived in Egypt. All of this shows that Hebrew identity has always been connected to Africa. The racial separation that we have been taught is a modern and highly ideological construct. Anthropology, archaeology, genetics, and oral tradition come together today to show that some of the tribes of Israel did not disappear. They were merely displaced. And many of them, such as the Lemba people, the Igbo, the Beta Israel, and others, are now awakening to their spiritual identity and seeking reconnection with their origins. And the most beautiful thing about all this is that, even after centuries of isolation, they have kept the spark of faith alive. They are living proof that the Hebrew heritage does not belong to one race, one political territory, or one exclusive group. It is a spiritual identity that transcends borders and, yes, has been preserved by many African peoples. This completely changes the spiritual map of the world. It changes how you look at Africa. It changes how you see yourself. Now imagine the impact of this revelation. Imagine what happens when millions of Black people discover that their spiritual heritage didn't begin with slavery, but with kings, priests, prophets, and divine covenants. When they understand that the blood that runs in their veins carries sacred memory, that is transformation, that is healing, that is historical justice. And you are part of this, because by listening to and sharing this truth, you are participating in the rebirth of a spiritual identity that the world has tried to erase. You are reconnecting with a story that is yours, that always was, but that was hidden. Now leave a comment below. My inheritance wasn't lost, it was hidden. Or write, the tribes of Israel still live. If you know someone from an African ethnic group who maintains customs similar to those in the Bible, mention them here too. Let's create a chain of rescue and reconnection. If everything we've seen so far is already making you rethink many things, what comes next will touch an even deeper level. Because we're not just talking about a hidden past or erased identities, we're talking about a prophetic future already announced in the scriptures, in which Africa not only appears prominently, but also fulfills a fundamental spiritual role in God's plan for the end times. And if you thought the references to Cush, Ethiopia, or the peoples of the South were just geographical details, prepare to see with new eyes. Biblical prophecies, especially those of the major and minor prophets, are full of references to Ethiopia, the land of Cush, and the African regions south of Israel. And these mentions are not random. They always appear in contexts of redemption, judgment, restoration, and glory. The first question we should ask ourselves is, why would the prophets mention these lands with such respect and spiritual reverence? And further, why is this part of Scripture almost never emphasized in traditional preaching and theological studies? Let's begin with the book of Isaiah, the prophet of hope and restoration. In Isaiah 18, we find one of the most mysterious and ignored prophecies in the Bible. The text begins with a direct mention, "Woe to the land of buzzing wings, beyond the rivers of Ethiopia." The description is poetic, but clear. It refers to a distant land with majestic rivers, a tall, feared, and powerful people. And what is most striking is that in verse 7, Isaiah states, "In that day a gift will be brought to the Lord Almighty from this scattered and warlike people, from a nation feared from then on and beyond, a nation of strange speech, whose land is crisscrossed by rivers, to the place of the name of the Lord Almighty, to Mount Zion." Can you understand what is being said here? From an African people will come a spiritual offering to the Lord, a prophetic gift. This is not a metaphor. It is a direct vision of the future, a moment when a marginalized people, coming from forgotten lands, will return to the center of God's purpose. This people is not Europe, it is not Asia, it is Africa. Isaiah is speaking of Ethiopia, the land of Cush, and it doesn't stop there. In Zephaniah 3:10, there is one of the most impactful and yet most ignored passages in the Bible. The prophet writes, "From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my worshippers, the scattered people, will bring me offerings." Pay attention to this. God is saying that his worshippers will come from Africa. Not just any people, but my people, as God himself calls them. This completely breaks the traditional narrative that has always placed Africa as peripheral in the divine plan. Zephaniah shows us that, even scattered, even forgotten, even silenced, the spiritual descendants of Cush, of Sheba, of Egypt, of Ethiopia, will continue to be recognized by God as part of his people, and in due time, they will rise up. They will bring offerings. They will reconnect with the promise. This is a prophecy that points directly to an Afrocentric spiritual awakening in the last days. Now think about this. If these prophecies have been recorded in the Bible for centuries, why does almost no one talk about them? Why aren't they part of eschatology courses? Why in churches, when talking about chosen peoples, is the name of Africa never mentioned? The answer, once again, lies in the Eurocentric construction of modern theology. It was more convenient to ignore the prophecies that exalted Africa than to accept that redemption would also pass through black lands. And if you think the Psalms were left out, you're mistaken. In Psalm 68:31, we find a verse that should be sung in all African congregations. "Princes will come from Egypt. Ethiopia will soon stretch out her hands to God." This is a powerful statement. Ethiopia, a symbol of black ancestral spiritual Africa, will stretch out her hands to God. It is a gesture of worship, of return, of reconciliation, and this has not yet fully happened. In other words, this prophecy is waiting to be fulfilled. It is waiting for the awakening of a people who have been taught to feel distant from God, but who, in truth, have always been in his plans. All these passages together construct a prophetic scenario that can no longer be ignored. Africa is not just part of the past of biblical faith, it is part of the future. The African continent, its descendants scattered throughout the world, the black peoples who have been torn from their spiritual identity, all of them are included in the fulfillment of the promises. Ethiopia, the land of Cush, Egypt, and the nations to the south have a spiritual role reserved for the end times. And this leads us to a profound reflection. Does Africa have a final spiritual mission? After all it has suffered, slavery, colonization, erasure, is there still a divine purpose for this people to fulfill? Are the offerings that will come from black peoples to the Lord's mountain already being prepared through this awakening we are experiencing today? More and more black men and women are rediscovering a faith rooted in tradition. They are studying the scriptures with eyes freed from colonization. They are finding in prophecy the confirmation that they have always been part of the plan, and that the plan is still unfolding. And perhaps, just perhaps, this movement of reclaiming and reconnecting that you are experiencing now is part of the fulfillment of those same prophecies. Perhaps you are experiencing the beginning of the return of a people who have always belonged to him, but who are now beginning to remember this.
And if this is happening, and I believe it is, then this video, this content, this conversation, it's not just information, it's prophecy in motion. It's the time coming. It's the breath of the Spirit touching sleeping consciences. If this made sense to you, if it resonated with you, comment below, "I am part of the prophecy," or "Ethiopia will extend its hands to God, and so will I." If you prefer, share the verse that touched you most in this passage.
It could be Isaiah 18, Zephaniah 3:10, or Psalm 68:31. Put in the comments what the Spirit is revealing to you. After going through the prophecies, after understanding that Africa was not only present but was announced as an active part of the divine plan for the future, what we are seeing now, before our eyes, is not just a cultural coincidence or an isolated movement of historical curiosity. What is happening is something much deeper. It is an awakening, a movement, a spiritual reconnection that is happening around the world among black men and women who are rediscovering their Hebrew roots. And this awakening, although silent in some places, is spreading like wildfire, because there is something that has been dormant for centuries, and now it is beginning to awaken. We are talking about people who for a long time lived oblivious to their own spiritual heritage, who attended churches for decades without ever hearing about Cush, Sheba, Ethiopia, or the black tribes of Israel. People who prayed, fasted, read the Bible, but never saw themselves represented in the sacred pages. And now, with access to information, studies, documents, preserved traditions, and even archaeological evidence, They are beginning to understand that their origins were systematically erased, but never ceased to exist. This movement has been gaining momentum in various parts of the world. In North America, Latin America, the Caribbean, several countries on the African continent, and even in Europe, there are Black people who are studying the Torah, celebrating biblical festivals such as Passover and Sukkot, rediscovering the importance of Shabbat, reclaiming Hebrew names, investigating their genetic roots, their family traditions, their ancestral songs. It's as if a spiritual memory is being activated, a memory that was buried under layers of colonization, imposed religiosity, and cultural self-denial. This is not a movement of rebellion, but of return. It is not a rejection of faith. It is a reunion with the original faith. It is a reclaiming of identity. Because when you understand that your ancestry is deeply intertwined with biblical figures, with priests, with kings, with prophets, with Christ himself who lived in Africa as a child, everything changes. The Bible ceases to be just a distant sacred book and becomes a mirror, a map, a spiritual family tree where you too have a branch. Several scholars have courageously raised this banner, people who have decided to confront academic and religious resistance to prove that the Black and African presence in the Bible is not a hypothesis, it is a fact. Black authors, theologians, archaeologists, and spiritual leaders have been showing that the history of salvation is not limited to Europe, and that the roots of the Abrahamic, Mosaic, and Christian faith have deep connections with African soil, with African customs, with the Black faces that have been ignored by the portrayers of institutionalized faith. And it's not just academic books or theological articles. There are also prophetic voices rising up among Black spiritual communities saying, remember who you are, return to the old path, reclaim your heritage, reassume your spiritual identity. This cry is echoing in worship services, study groups, conversation circles, social media, and videos like this one. Because Black people are waking up. They are returning. They are understanding that they were never excluded by God. They were only deceived by systems that benefited from their ignorance. And here it's important to ask a direct question. Have you been conditioned to deny your true origins? Were you taught from childhood to think that your features, your color, your culture were worldly things, spiritual obstacles, works of the flesh? Were you led to believe that holiness had a European accent, a European appearance, a European liturgy? If so, that wasn't your fault. But now that the truth is before you, what will you do with it? Perhaps you're remembering grandparents who always observed the Sabbath, even without knowing exactly why. Perhaps you've heard family stories that mention Hebrew names, different customs, ancient prayers that seemed out of the ordinary. Perhaps you've never felt completely like you belonged in traditional churches, even though you love God with all your soul. All of this may be a sign that the spark is there inside, waiting to be rekindled. This awakening of biblical African consciousness is not a fad. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's not victimhood. It's restoration. It's the return of a people who were torn from their spiritual identity and are now beginning to understand that they were always in the promises, always part of the covenant, always carried within themselves the divine image, even if the system said otherwise. And this process isn't the same for everyone. Some will feel it first in their hearts. Others will need study, reflection, and confrontation with their old beliefs. Still others will resist, and that's okay. The important thing is that the truth is spreading, and once you see it, there's no unseeing it. You can try to ignore it for a while, but something inside you has already changed. It's not about abandoning everything you've learned, but about completing what you were taught only partially. It's about restoring what was broken. It's about rebuilding what was torn down. It's about telling the world, I know my origins, I know where I came from, and I know where I'm going. Now I want to hear from you. If this video is sparking something inside you, comment below, I am awakening to my spiritual heritage, or my roots are alive. If you prefer, share how you felt watching this excerpt. Was it comfort, confrontation, relief, anger, hope? All of that is valid. All of that is part of the process. Your comments are seeds for others to awaken as well. If you've stayed with me this far, it's because something inside you has been awakened, and that's no coincidence. You are seeking truth, identity, purpose, and this journey is only just beginning. So do the following. Subscribe to the channel now, because here you'll continue discovering everything that has been hidden for centuries. Leave a like if this video spoke to you and brought you revelations that no one has ever told you before. And comment below, "I went all the way, and I'm ready for the truth." This phrase will show me that you are part of this awakening generation, and it will also help the video reach more people who need to hear this. And before you leave, don't forget to click on the next video that's appearing on your screen right now. It will delve even deeper into what we've discussed here and take you to the next level of this spiritual journey. I'll see you there. Shalom.